get underway. And I'm first of all, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're very lucky to have with us our special guest, Lisa Blair. Lisa, in 2017, made history becoming the first woman to sail solo around Antarctica with an emergency stop in Cape Town, South Africa, to repair a broken mast. She is actually attempting us to do a second rounding later on this year, and tonight we're going to learn more about it. But, 14,000 nautical miles in 90 days, I think, is the target.
Yeah.
Trying to beat the current record of 102 days, planning to depart December this year. Joining us tonight also, we have Kirstine Revlin, who, those of you who haven't come across Kirstine is one of our Tuesday Twilight Yngling sailors. She's also a Saturday sailor, Division 2, is that right?
Division 1, yes.
Division 1, sorry, I don't know my big boats. But to set the scene tonight, we are going to start off with a very quick video, and then I'm going to be handing over to Kirstine and Lisa. So here we go. It has to play. Sorry. Yep.
When you're out there on your own, there's nobody else you can rely on. You're so far from help. From what I could tell, and my meteorologist and my other advisors could tell, the swell was going to be a little bit bigger and the storms were going to be more frequent. I thought I'd ticked every box. I thought I'd done everything I could possibly do to make it safer, but it didn't change the fact that I was still throwing in that life or death situation. 5 days of extreme sleep deprivation, I just felt like I couldn't keep going. I felt like the world was telling me not to go, and I started listening to those doubters. I started listening to the naysayers that were saying, don't go, you can't do it. I'm so close to home. I have to step up, I have to get out, I have to make it work. Heaven's been demolished because I've just been released on fire. I'll go through it again. If you haven't prepared for something, thought about all the risk, if you haven't thought about all the scenarios you might encounter, then you're not going to succeed out there.
Thank you very much, Karen, and certainly we will share the link to this really great video that you can listen to it later again. Welcome everyone. I'm very excited to have tonight the possibility to interview such a great person. We spoke to each other now every night in the last 3 days, so I feel that we already know each other very, very well. Welcome, Lisa, also from my side.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys. And thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. I hope that, we have a great evening and have a glass of wine, and it keeps you guys a little company down there in sad Sydney at the moment.
Thank you. Solo around Antarctica. You have recently announced that you are wanted to try it again, to go solo, non-stop,
yes,
unassisted around Antarctica at the end of this year. Mm-hmm. A lot of people ask me the question, like, how is it possible that that girl has that crazy idea to go to the Antarctica sailing? We have so beautiful sailing areas around. And what I learned is that actually only in 2004, in your 20s, you learned or got your interest in sailing. And this was in the Whitsundays when you were a hostess on a cruiser. So tell me, from starting sailing on a cruiser in the Whitsundays with warm climate to the journey of wanting to go solo around the Antarctica. Give me a little bit of link to that. How did that work?
Yeah, it was a little bit of an unusual path. So I was actually studying visual arts and education at university, and I just happened to have like a gap in my schedule of 6 months before I could do my final course. So I randomly got this job in the Whitsundays as the cook and the cleaner on a charter yacht. So I started my sailing career literally scrubbing toilets and sponging the bilges and doing all those really crappy jobs, no pun intended, that you have to do when you're, you know, just starting out on a boat. And I just started getting really fascinated with just the terminology and understanding the physics behind how does a boat move through the water with just the sails. And I really just started to see sailing as more than just like a Sunday afternoon wine and dine or lay out on a deck of a boat in a bikini kind of activity. And I started to get more engrossed in the you know, how do you fix things on a boat? How do you tack a boat? And what's a reef? And just started really like kind of asking those questions. And I was really fortunate at the time that my skipper and deckhand really fostered that knowledge and spent a lot of time teaching me what they could share with me. So I worked for this charter company in the Whitsundays for a year, and then I finished my university degree. And like the week I finished, I had a friend call me up out of the blue who I also studied at uni with, and she was sailing to Hawaii with her dad on a 40-foot little steel boat. And they said, we need crew. Can you get here in a week? And so I deferred everything again and packed up my life and jumped on a plane, and I flew to Samoa and then spent 3 months sailing from Samoa to Hawaii. And that was my first ocean passage. I'd never sailed overnight. I'd never stood a watch before. I had no idea what that experience was going to be like, whether I'd love it or hate it. But I had a pretty good idea. I loved sailing, and I just fell in love with that concept of ocean sailing to the point where you know, it's that goal of how do you get a boat from point A to point B across an ocean using just the wind and overcoming all of those micro challenges that you face on a daily basis out to sea. And I just really loved the sort of simplicity of life at sea like that. So I ended up working on a charter boat in Hawaii for 8 months. And when I returned to Australia, I got this really crappy job selling costume jewelry in the mall for $20 an hour. I had no savings. I had no real opportunities, but I just had this kind of drive to do more with sailing or to see where this kind of adventure took me. And I still was at that point planning completely to be an art teacher. And I was just going to spend the next, you know, maybe a year sailing and cruising and then see what happens. And I found out about the Clipper Round the World Yacht Race. Is everyone kind of familiar with that race? So it's an amateur yacht race where you pay a berth fee. So the berth fee at the time when I did it for the whole circumnavigation was 80,000 Australian dollars. I was earning $20 an hour at the mall, doing nothing. So I honestly didn't think it was something that was going to be possible, but you sign up, you pay this berth fee, and then there's 10 identical yachts that race each other around the planet. And you do 15 races over 8 legs, and you circumnavigate. And the whole distance of the race is 40,000 nautical miles. And at that point, I'd started reading, you know, your Kay Cotty books and your Jessica Watson. She was just finishing her circumnavigation, and Dee Kafari and Robin Knox-Johnson. And I started reading all these books about solo sailing, and I just loved hearing their stories. And I related to them in a level where I really thought that they weren't anyone special. They weren't these unique characters that spent their whole life sailing, that were specifically special at the job, but they had a dream and they decided that they would apply themselves to learning the knowledge that they needed to go and achieve that dream. And so I really started to think at that point that maybe one day, and in my mind, I was thinking like 30 years down the track, I might want to try solo sailing, but I had no idea like what was in store for me. But I found, I signed up, did the Clipper race and raced around the world. And it was after that I decided to give solo sailing a crack.
The Clipper race was 2011 and 12.
Yes.
And then your next big step was in 15 and then in 17? Or how do you get then really from the solo racing to really coming up with that really crazy idea, solo around the Antarctica? And why was it, by the way, solo around the Antarctica and not around Australia?
Well, let me answer that as a part two. Let me answer that as a part two, because there's a really good answer to that. So I basically landed back in Australia after the Clipper race, decided that maybe I could get my commercial tickets. I did my Master 5 and I got my Yacht Master instructor license, and I started kind of going down the commercial route of teaching sailing. And I had sailed now sort of 40,000 nautical miles around the planet. So I had a decent enough knowledge to start skippering, but you know, I had to teach myself how to park a boat and do all that sort of basic stuff that I had never done before, and then had to work out how do you teach somebody else how to park a boat and go down that route. And I went back to the Whitsundays and I started skippering the boats that I learnt to sail on. And while I was doing that, I started kind of pondering the idea of what's possible, what else can I do? Because you know, 2 years earlier, I didn't even contemplate that I would sail across another ocean in my life, and I just circumnavigated the planet, and what else was possible. And I came across the solo Trans-Tasman yacht race, the ITL Tasman yacht race, and that runs once every 4 years, and it's New Plymouth to Mooloolaba on the Sunshine Coast. And I was like, oh my God, perfect, because this allows me to sail into my home port. At this point, my family, you know, hadn't been able to be there for any of the port arrivals or anything. And so it was a great way for them to be able to see what I was achieving with sailing. And so I remember calling mum up and having this chat to her. And I was like, so what do you think about me sailing solo to New Zealand to then race back from New Zealand to Australia? And you know, this is something I'm looking at doing. And she was adamant that I couldn't do it, and that it wasn't like, not that I couldn't do it, but that it was too big of a leap. And I just couldn't shake the idea. And so I started delving into it, and I called the race committee up in New Zealand, and I asked them, you know, when was the latest date that somebody had to have a boat for to be able to sign up? And the guy just started laughing on the phone, because I was signing up to this yacht race and I didn't even own a boat, and I had never sailed solo before, but I had 12 months and I was going to figure it out. And so then I ended up finding a boat that was lent to me just a couple of weeks before the race start, and that was Roger McMillan, who was then the editor of My Sailing. And so he lent me his boat, and I was able to sail it solo to New Zealand and then race it back to Australia. And in that process of trying to find a boat and trying to raise the sponsorship, I'd approached this guy, James Buick, and he was just another sailor, and he had an open 40 racing yacht. And I was trying to convince anybody that, you know, how can you convince someone who owns a boat to lend me a boat to go and race it solo across to New Zealand and back when I'd never sailed solo. And he was like, no, I'm not going to lend you the boat, even if I paid a rental fee. But if you maybe combine this project with a bigger project, you could possibly buy the boat and then do both projects. And I was thinking, you got a question?
No, I say it's very, very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah.
To have somebody offering a boat and then even coming up with the big idea. Karen, I just see behind you lots, the ladies of the sea. We are always asking our members if they could take a woman as a lead on the boat. It would be only Sydney Harbour. It would not go to New Zealand. Well, you're on your trip. You want to go to New Zealand. Now you want to build it up with a much bigger project.
Yeah, so his suggestion was, why don't I combine it with another project so I could buy his boat, and that way I'd have this really fast racing yacht and it'll be amazing, and I could pull it together. He had then suggested that there was this record he was looking at, but he'd postponed it because he's now got a young family and he didn't want to go and do records anymore because he was raising his kids, and he didn't want to go and do it. So he was actually the person that suggested there's this record sailing around Antarctica, and there's this Russian sailor, Fedor Konyakov, who circumnavigated Antarctica in 2008 on a 78-foot aluminium monohull racing yacht, custom-built racing yacht. And his suggestion was, why don't I have a crack at challenging that record? The boat was perfect for it, and he was planning on that trip at one point in his career, and he thought that would be a way to kind of attract attention, to raise the money, to then go and do the New Zealand yacht race, to just even get started. And I remember saying to him, Antarctica, you're crazy. Like, no, why would someone want to go and sail around Antarctica solo? Like, at this point, I'd done the Southern Ocean with crew of 16 people in the Clipper race. And I'd seen, you know, a couple of storms in the Southern Ocean, and I'd seen those 60, 70-foot waves. And I'd just seen the ferociousness of the Southern Ocean. And I remember just being so focused on the fact that it was an impossible voyage and there's no way I could do a trip like that. But then I spent like the next 3 months kind of daydreaming about it while I was still working in the tropics in the Whitsunday Islands, and I was pondering it, and I was like, I wonder what kind of boat you would need for that trip. Like how cold was cold going to get? And I just started like kind of really delving into it. And after a while, I worked out that it was a possibility that this is a trip you could do. And maybe one day it might be something I'd like to do. And then that turned into a 4-year campaign to raise the money, to find the sponsorship, to then get the boat, to then try and sail around Antarctica solo. And here we are today.
Yeah. Let me first ask, your mother already reacted a bit like, are you crazy, girl, to go to New Zealand? So what did she say when she said, no, now I make it just a little bit differently. I go to New Zealand and I go around Antarctica as well.
She said flat out, no, straight away. She was absolutely no way. You're not sailing solo around Antarctica. And I asked her before I did the Trans-Tasman yacht race. So I hadn't even sailed solo at that point at all. And then I raced the boat 3,000 miles. So I sailed it to New Zealand and then I raced it back. And after that, I said to her again, I was like, so what do you think about this Antarctica idea? Maybe we should have a shot. Like I should have a crack at that. And she was like, oh, I mean, I guess you've got enough experience now. And sort of, I twisted her arm, and she's not gave me permission, but she gave me her support to be able to do that.
Which is, of course, very, very important.
Yeah.
You mentioned the record from the Russian Sedor, who did the record in 2008 in 102 days.
Yes.
And you also mentioned that he had an aluminium boat and was 78. What about your boat? And we come to that name in a second also, but tell us a little bit about the technique about your boat. How long, big, and what do you have on the boat for yourself?
Yeah, so the boat I have is a 50-foot yacht. She's fiberglass balsa cord. So that basically means that you have an internal skin, which is like 8 or 9 layers of fiberglass, and it's about 5 mil thick or 6 mil thick. And then you have 1 inch of balsa wood, and then you have another layer of fiberglass on top. When I started down this road, I did do a lot of digging into different materials and the pros and cons of taking a steel boat or an aluminium boat or a carbon fiber boat or a fiberglass boat. And each style of boat had a different pro or con. And I ended up settling on a fiberglass boat because of the accessibility and then also the repairability of that boat myself at sea. So like a steel boat, for a steel boat to be effective on the record, I would have to push the boat really hard because the boat would be 30, 35 ton, maybe 40 tons. So it means you're putting a lot of pressure into your sails and your rigging, and you're ending up having to carry more sail in heavier winds, which gives you a higher probability of breaking sails than you would if you had a lighter vessel. And then most steel boats only have kind of one collision compartment at the front, and then generally the rest of the compartment's pretty open-ended. So if you did have a collision with an iceberg, the chances of it not rupturing the hull were too big of a risk. And then if it did rupture the hull, there wouldn't be enough trapped air to remain buoyant, so it would sink the boat. An aluminium boat to have the same properties as a steel boat in a high-speed collision with an iceberg, it would require being a custom built or adding more layers of aluminium to the hull of the boat. You have the problem if you buy a secondhand boat that you can't really identify all the problems in the boat necessarily straight off the bat. You can get them ultrasounded, but it's quite an expensive process. And it also had the same problem that not a lot of aluminium boats have a lot of bulkheads. So again, if I had a collision and I had a failure of the hull, I would probably end up sinking. And out in the Southern Ocean, in the longitudes and latitudes that I was traveling, I wouldn't survive in a life raft. So I was planning on how do I keep the boat floating over anything else. Then you've got carbon fiber, and carbon fiber is a really great material. It's light, it's got a high strength weight ratio to the lightness, and a lot of carbon fiber boats have a lot of bulkheads, so there's those pros to it. The con is it doesn't perform very well in cold climates. It becomes a bit more brittle. And also with carbon fiber, if you have an impact and it's super strong until its failure point, when it reaches its failure point, it has a tendency to shatter or crack in a larger area than the isolated impact zone. So if I had an incident and I hit an iceberg, for example, I would have a crack right through the bow of the boat all the way through, rather than it being an isolated impact zone. The properties of balsa is it actually transfers the load out through the hull. So if you imagine you have the kind of balsa core is in the middle here, and you've got the two layers of glass, if you have something hit this side, you might have a hole of like yay big, or however big the impact zone is, but then it transfers that load outwards into the balsa. So the inside skin blows off, it flexes and blows off, and the balsa itself will compress and transfer that load out. And the inside skin might have 2 or 3 meters of delamination, but it's solid and it's sound and it's watertight. And it's also a material I can take fiberglass, I can take resin and epoxy at sea, and I have the possibility of potentially repairing it. And the other thing with that is that my boat has 7 watertight compartments. So in theory, I can lose the entire bow of the boat in a major collision with an iceberg or shipping container or something else, and still be watertight enough to float until aid arrived, or to aid myself.
Okay, it sounds absolutely amazing and very, very, very interesting. But Lisa, tell me, I mean, I assume you have a hot shower and hot coffee.
You're
every
hilarious.
day. How can I imagine your day on your boat? I remember that you said it just very briefly in 3 words, which was eat,
sleep, sail.
Sail. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then tomorrow it was eat, sleep, and sail.
Yeah. What's the weather doing? Yeah, I don't have, I actually ripped the hot water system out of the boat when I bought it because it was useless, and I wouldn't be having hot showers inside the boat anyway because I don't carry enough water for those kind of things. So my showers were a bucket and a couple of kettles of hot water on the back deck of the boat on a slightly sunny day. And you're shivering, miserable on the back deck and trying to shower as quick as possible. And then, yeah, so I basically, my routine got quite warped because I was operating on Australian time zone most of the time, as far as connecting with shore crew and with media and like, you know, uploading blogs and things like that. So as I went around the planet, when I got to like Cape Town and South Africa and the likes, I was on the opposite time zones to Australia. So I would end up being actually awake all night and then try and sleep through in the morning until about 1 or 2 o'clock. And then I'd be up again until, you know, 6 or 7 in the morning.
Explain when you say I would sleep,
yeah,
what that actually means, because when I say I would sleep, it means I actually have my eyes closed and sleep deeply, hopefully. But when you use the word sleep, it has a little bit of different meaning.
Yeah, good question. So when I'm close to land or near known hazards, such as an island or a known fishing ground or potential icebergs, things like that, I don't sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time. So a container ship can get from beyond the horizon to you in just over 20 minutes if you're both on a closing course. So in general, every 20 minutes, I wake up and I do a visual scan of the horizon. We have electronic instruments on the boat. So I have AIS and I have radar, but you can't 100% ever rely on your electronic instruments, and line of sight and visibility is the best, most reliable method for keeping a good watch and keeping a safe lookout. So, you know, we all know the coal regs. Rule number 5 is keeping a good lookout by all available means. So I would do a 4 to 6 hour block of sleep, and in that 6 hour block I would be waking up every 20 minutes and I'm getting out of my bunk and climbing up on deck and having a 360 scan of the horizon, and then going back down into my bunk and hitting the alarm for another 20 minutes, and then I'd get up and do it again. And So it normally takes about 2 or 3 cycles before I can get a 10-minute or 5-minute actual increment of sleep, but it's all broken sleep. And the interesting thing with Antarctica was that I was so remote that the risk of collision to a ship or vessel was almost minuscule, that I could actually increase my sleep patterns up to 40 minutes. Once I think I slept like an hour and a half in one single sleep, which was pretty rejuvenative and amazing. But the rest of the time it was all small sleeps. And even if I wanted to increase it, the boat needs attention more frequently than that, because the wind changes or the sea state's changing, or you need to shake a reef or do something like that.
I would like our audience just to imagine the situation that you're 3 months alone, 16,000 nautical miles. You have snowstorms, you have hailstorms, you have wind chill minus 20 degrees. They're dodging icebergs, and you have never less than 30 knots of wind. You have 6 to 8 meter high waves, and you're there
10
by
at
your
times, 15 at times.
Yeah, so I just want that our audience imagine that. Absolutely amazing. So for me, of course, I'm pretty sure that a lot of people would have asked you the question, how do you survive? And how did you prepare your family for that? Because, I mean, I would say that could be also a situation where you possibly do not come back.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a very real risk of the project, and it's exactly the same risk this project. With that sort of discussion, like I sat down with my family and I talked about what would happen if I didn't come home, and I talked about a will and you know, all the debt I'd incurred by doing the project and what that would mean for my family. But I also clearly explained to them that I would rather go out to sea and do this project and potentially not come home than not do it because I'm scared of something that is outside of my control. And when we think about car crashes every day and people getting sick or cancer or, you know, any number of things can kill somebody, this was a very calculated risk, in the sense that there's a big difference between what people perceive as risk and what is the actual risk we're facing. And for me, it was all about, like, how do I negate the risk? How do I put like procedures and policies in place? What modifications do I do to the boat to make it safer? And when I talked to my family, I would make sure that I included them in all of those decisions. So they knew I wasn't just going, oh yeah, let's slap some new sails on this boat, let's put some signage up and woo, let's go sail around Antarctica. She'll be right, mate. It was completely every minute of the planning they were included in, and they were, if they had questions about whether I was doing something safely enough, I would then discuss with them what those decisions were and why, and what were the limitations and what was the risk associated with that sort of modification or not modification, and just really included them in that process. And that was a really big part of it.
I like a lot of your quotes, but one I would like to share at this moment, because I find it really fascinating that you said, I didn't want my unknown fear disturb my dream.
Yeah.
And I think very often we may not do things because there is an unknown fear to something. And at the moment, a lot of people may have that even, and but didn't want to disturb my dreams. I really love that. I would like to set the scene for day 72. Mm-hmm. Day 72, out of 100, you are actually 1 day in front of the world record of Fedor. Everything is going well. Everything seems to be completely all right. You were in your bunk. Bang! Out of nowhere, coming on deck, realizing your mast crashed. Mm. I've had that in Sydney Harbour, and I must admit, I already didn't like that situation. But when I imagine you are 1,000 nautical miles from land, there's no boat around you, and you have such a severe thing happening to your boat. What do you do then? What's your brain doing? Is your brain working then, or are you going crazy in that moment?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because it's such a huge part of my story because of the trauma associated with surviving that dismasting. But again, it comes back to that preparation. So in my pre-planning preparation part of the project, I had gone to different riggers and I'd sat them down and we'd had different discussions around, okay, if this scenario occurred, what would I do? If that scenario occurred, what would I do? And one of those scenarios was, what happens if I dismast? And the general consensus was that on average, a mast will snap at the first spreader or above, but it's very unlikely for them to snap at the deck level. And my mast itself is mounted on the keel, so it goes through the hull of the boat and mounts on the keel. And so the advice I was given was it's highly improbable that that would happen, and that's exactly what happened to me. So my D1 snapped, my diagonal rigging wire, and within 30 seconds, the mast had come crashing down in this storm. And I was in 6 to 8 meter breaking seas. I had sort of 35 to 45 knots of wind, keeping in mind that that's 35 to 45 knots Southern Ocean winds, which is sort of almost equivalent to 50 to 60 knots here. And I, like you said, I was 1,000 miles from land. So my initial reaction was, this is so not good, and a whole bunch of swear words that I won't say right now. And also just the complete heartache of the fact that now everything was over. I'd worked for 3.5 years on this record and it was suddenly finished. Like in one heart-stopping moment, it was finished. And then I had to work out, okay, the record's over, but how do I survive the night? How do I keep the boat floating? How do I work out how to get to land? And the biggest risk was the way the mast had snapped. It had fallen to the starboard side of the boat and it had turned into like an anchor in the water. So there's all the sails and it was dragging in the water. And I had my third reef in at the time and my storm jib up, and my 2 forestay sails were furled away. And because it turned me around 180, it now was on the windward side of the hull. So you were getting these sort of 8-9 meter waves coming through, and they were hitting the sails first and the mast, and they were driving the mast up on the hull of the boat. And it was creating this like really aggressive kind of seesaw motion. And the bottom stump, the kind of last meter and a half of the mast was still on the deck of the boat. And it was all kind of tangled up with all the ropes and the reefing lines and all the existing piece of rigging. And that, I just remember thinking in clear panic, like any one of those waves can pull just that little bit harder, break that last piece of rope, and then the next wave would drive it through the hull of the boat and start potentially sinking me. And I was very well aware that, you know, I was 48, sorry, I was at 48 degrees, 30 minutes south. So I was pretty far south, and it was about 3 degrees air temperature that night and blowing a gale. So your wind temperature, like your wind ratio was like -20. And I just remember thinking, if I went in that life raft, I was committing myself to death, because there was absolutely no way in those seas that life raft was going to survive for 3 days until help arrived. So my only course of action, my only option was, how do I get rid of the mast from the boat fast enough to stop it sinking the boat in these storm conditions? And that became my sole focus, because if I lost the boat, then I was lost, and everything else became negligible to that kind of decision. And I remember there was like 15 minutes of utter complete panic. And then I ran inside the boat and I started ripping apart tools, and I was trying to find a better way to disconnect the rigging, and I just couldn't. And it wasn't until I was a good 15-20 minutes into the emergency that I realized that nobody anywhere in the world knew I was going through this. I hadn't called anybody or told them. And so I phoned my shore manager up and I issued a pan at that time. And I said, you know, I'm not sinking yet. And I knew a mayday wouldn't get there fast enough to help me regardless. So I either saved the boat and I lived, or I didn't save the boat and I didn't live, and a mayday wasn't going to be any different anyway. So I issued the pan because of that. Unbeknown to me, they upgraded me to a mayday because I was a solo sailor, and because of the location that I was in, they made that upgrade. They made that choice to upgrade and diverted a container ship towards me. But that container ship was 600 miles away, and it was going to take them 3 days to reach me at a minimum. So yeah, it became a 4-hour ordeal of pitching and rolling around the deck in the dark, trying to disconnect the rigging wire. The bolt cutters didn't work. The waves were breaking clean across, so an angle grinder was not an option because of the amount of water volume going across the boat. I didn't even think of a hacksaw. It was a suggestion that was given to me much later, but yeah, it just became this horrendous ordeal of fighting to keep the boat floating. And I ended up with hypothermia after the ordeal, and I was able to separate the mast from the boat, and I lost it all in the Southern Ocean, and I was able to recover the boom, and that was the only part of the boat that was left afterwards. And it had also gouged a hole the size of a dinner plate in the whole deck joint on the starboard side, where the mast was kind of seesawing back and forth. It was acting like a saw, and it was literally cutting through the boat. And when it finally got through the top layers, it started cutting really quite quickly, and so my time was running out.
Lisa, our audience got very active, which I'm very happy about. And Simon is asking, what does it mean 3 days for help to arrive? And I can definitely recommend that little YouTube video where you're next to that container boat. Why were you next? Or what did you do with that container boat?
Yeah, so I was 1,000 nautical miles from land. So your average plane has enough fuel in a rescue scenario to fly 200 kilometers from land, kilometers, not nautical miles, conduct a rescue, and then fly 200 kilometers back. So for me, being so far from land, in part of my procedures before I even left is my passage plan and my details on who I was and the vessel, my shore manager's contacts, my satellite phone information, and my tracking information was sent to every rescue coordination center globally, whose oceans we were traveling through. And then part of my shore manager's role was to notify the different rescue coordination centers when I would enter their regulated waters, and then again when I exited their waters, so that they could then follow the tracker as I was going through their waters. So if an incident occurred, they knew exactly who the boat was, who the person was, what safety equipment I had on board, my capabilities, my medical history, my first aid kit. Like, they knew everything about me before I even left. And so the volunteer rescue group that operates out of Cape Town had started following me before I dismasted. So they'd followed me as I entered their rescue coordination area, and were tracking my movements through their area. And then when the Pan was issued to them, and it was upgraded to a Mayday, the guy who was at the volunteer version of the organization, which is kind of like our kind of Coast Guard, so to speak, or the US Coast Guard, they started planning immediately how they would get me from the boat if I upgraded to a Mayday. And I met him when I arrived in Cape Town after I self-rescued, and he talked through, you know, what their strategy was going to be. And the fastest way to rescue me was going to be fly a helicopter to its maximum range, land the helicopter onto the deck of a container ship, drive the ship as far as it could to get within range of a helicopter rescue, and then pick up the helicopter, fly it out, rescue me, fly back to the container ship, land on the ship, motor back as close to land as they could get, and then fly the helicopter to land. And that whole operation was 3 to 4 days. So that was the fastest recovery possible, given the location and the lack of vessels nearby for a rescue. So what we ended up doing, like, I self-rescued in the end. I didn't abandon my boat, and I didn't take the rescue, which is one of the reasons why I never issued a Mayday myself. But because I'd survived the night, I knew I would be able to motor north and potentially rendezvous with a ship, or build a jury rig and motor sail my way up further north. And I had to kind of make a plan around that. And one choice was whether I continued with the record under jury rig, and I did the final South Indian Ocean back to Australia. But given where the structural damage was to the hull of the boat, at the middle of the boat, right on a strong point at a bulkhead there, I deemed it too risky to head into the Southern Ocean or continue in the Southern Ocean with a compromised vessel like that, because you get these sort of 10-meter waves, but the spacing between the waves, they're like mountains. They're not sharp peaks. They're like big mountains that roll through. And what can happen in storm conditions is you can get pinned between the two mountains, and the boat gets kind of thrown into the face of the other mountain, and you end up in a situation where the boat gets compressed sideways because the wave catches up behind, and then you're hitting the bow of the wave in front. And I was worried that I would get in a bad storm and the boat would actually be snapped in half because of the damage in the middle of the boat. So because of that, I decided to build a jury rig and motor sail my way up to Cape Town as the safest choice. And you know, in all my planning and all my projects, and I carry this across to this next project as well, everything is around risk management and putting my safety above anything else. Like, the record is complete bonus. If I can achieve that, wonderful. But at the end of the day, my goal is to sail around Antarctica and come home alive, because if I can't do that, then there's no point in leaving. So I ended up rendezvousing with this container ship that had been diverted to my aid. And 3 days later, after they were motoring south and I was motoring north, we attempted a fuel transfer in the Southern Ocean, 800 miles from land, in 6 meter swell and 25 knots of wind. And I did see a question come up, why is the wind stronger in the Southern Ocean? So for those of you who are late to join, we did touch on this at the very beginning while we were just sort of chatting ahead of this interview. And basically what happens is the wind is a lot colder. The air temperature is much lower. So it creates a heavier air, so to speak. So the wind, because it's more dense, applies more pressure to your sails. So a rough rule of thumb is 30 knots in the Southern Ocean is equivalent to what you would feel as 50 knots of wind in Sydney Harbour. So if you imagine a storm with 60 knots of wind in the Southern Ocean, that's like 80, 90 knots of wind in Sydney Harbour. So the force applied to the boat is much more dramatic, much earlier. And I did mention in the beginning that I would be down to my third reef in my mainsail and my storm jib at 35 knots of wind, whereas in Sydney Harbour, I would maybe have one reef in my mainsail because the forces applied to the sails are quite different. So I rendezvoused with the ship and we attempted a fuel transfer, which resulted in a collision at sea and me almost losing my boat a second time, which was not a lot of fun.
Another question from Simon was like, how often did you sleep through your 20 minutes nap?
I didn't actually. I've slept through it once, and that was when I circumnavigated Australia. So you did pose the question, and I didn't get the chance to answer it, about why Antarctica and why not Australia at the beginning. You weren't the first person to ask that question, and I get people all the time that say, why don't you go and sail around something tropical? Why don't you do something pleasant? Why go in this crazy trip around Antarctica? And at the time, I actually looked into, you know, the weather patterns and assessed the risk between sailing solo around Australia and sailing solo around Antarctica. And I actually deemed it a much higher risk and a lower chance of success sailing solo around Australia than sailing solo around Antarctica. With Antarctica, if you can adapt to the storms and prepare your boat for the storms and prepare yourself for the storms, then there's really nothing else out there. There's no one to hit. There's no, you know, islands and reefs and other traffic. Like, you're in the middle of nowhere. And whilst icebergs were a potential risk, I was getting satellite forecasting on that. So it was a fairly negligible risk to me. Whereas Australia, you miss your alarm once, you sleep through your alarm once, and you're in front of a container ship, you're on a reef, you're sailing into a cliff. So I slept through my alarm once on that trip, and it was when I'd left Sydney and I was sailing up towards the outside of Fraser Island, and I was going to branch off and go outside the Great Barrier Reef from there. And I had about 5 days where I had a container ship within 20 minutes of me for 5 solid days. So for 5 days, I couldn't sleep more than a 10-minute micro sleep. And so I was just degrading quite quickly and unable to sort of refresh myself, whereas I'd normally be able to achieve a bit more sleep. But the traffic was just so intense and the conditions were quite good for a couple of those days. So you had to be physically on deck looking for small fishing boats and tinnies and things that aren't necessarily going to show up on radar or AIS. And then you've got, you know, fishing buoys and reefs and rocks and islands and all sorts of stuff to dodge. And I remember waking up after going to sleep, and I thought I'd set my alarm correctly and I hadn't. And I just woke up with this complete feeling of utter dread, and like my stomach like was revolting, and there was just something horribly wrong. And I ran up on the deck of the boat and I looked out, and there was this big cliff face like right in front of me, and I'd been sailing directly to the shore, and I was about to smash up on this cliff. It was about probably 300-400 meters ahead of me. So I threw a big tack in really quickly and tacked out to sea, but it just, you just can't have that chance where you can sleep through. So for me, I have an ultrasonic, loud alarm clock for deaf people. And I know other solo sailors like Hugo Boss, he has a watch that allows you to get like an electric shock that wakes him up in these situations. So yeah, it's pretty crazy, but you just got to put yourself through it.
Yeah,
that's why it's a record, and not everyone wants to do it, right?
No, absolutely not. And Simon, the other question which you had about the worst experience, I remember that you are describing a moment when you actually left Cape Town and you continued sailing, that you had, I don't know whether you would describe it, that your worst situation on your trip, but I remember that your mother helped you in that situation. Can you briefly talk us what happened and why, how was your mother helping you?
Yeah, it's funny because most people would imagine the dismasting being the most traumatic part of the trip, and it was. But I never really understood how trauma or PTSD or living and surviving through a scenario like that would actually affect my mental health when I restarted the voyage. And I arrived in Cape Town with $0, no idea of how I was going to pull it together, but this goal that I was going to get another mast for my boat, and I was going to keep going, and I was going to set this record with one stop. And I managed to find a mast that had been in this shed in Cape Town for like 15 years in storage. It was a 30-year-old mast that happened to fit my boat, that I picked up for 5,000 Australian, and with some negotiations with the insurance company and my existing sponsors and volunteers. And I think I ended up with like $20,000 in donations from the public to help get me started. I was ready to go. It took 2 months to repair the damage, which meant that the weather patterns in the Southern Ocean changed quite dramatically. And we started going into winter in the Southern Ocean. And every week delayed in the repairing of the boat meant another week further into winter in the Southern Ocean. And Bob McDavitt, my meteorologist at the time, I'd requested that he give me any available forecasting for what the possible worst case scenario would be in the Southern Ocean in winter. Like, how bad was bad? What's the difference between winter in the Southern Ocean and summer in the Southern Ocean? And I needed to work out whether I felt I was going to be capable to sail through winter in the Southern Ocean. And everyone's perceived risk of it is that it's impossible. And why would someone go to the Southern Ocean in winter? And it's a death sentence is generally what the public kind of view it as. And so when word got out that I was leaving, I started to get all these messages from people in the public, and just random strangers commenting and saying I shouldn't go, and it's suicide, and why would I think I'm capable of something like that? And it just became like this overwhelming additional hurdle I had to face. And then I justified it because I had done my research and done my homework, and with what conditions I'd already sailed through, I knew it was possible. It was just a matter of, it was a difference of whether I wanted to put myself through that conditions rather than what it was an impossibility. And so I left, and I got 5 days out, and the storms are going from west to east. And as they're traveling across, they're going sideways, and I'm trying to go directly south to where I dismasted and cross my track before I could head back to Australia. And that meant that I had to get from north to south across these storms. But because they were so much more frequent in winter, it was the storm the size of like one of the worst hurricanes you can imagine, every 2 days, every 3 days. Like, it's 15-meter swell. So a 15-meter wave is a 5-story building. So you're sailing in a 15-meter wave, and then you have 60 to 80 knots of wind on top of that. So you then have the top 3 meters of the wave breaking and throwing over, and you get this gray wall of white water, and it's just horrendous. And so we were trying to avoid the worst of these conditions by trying to get a gap between the storms. And I knew once I was traveling with the weather, it wouldn't be so bad. But the problem was I was trying to cross the storms. And we just weren't getting a gap. And after 5 days, I was seasick. I had a cold. I was absolutely miserable. I was getting my ass handed to me on a silver platter because I was just getting bashed around in that boat like nothing else. I almost got washed overboard by this massive wave that tried to rip me off the deck, and it terrified me because it was the closest I'd ever come to maybe getting washed overboard. And I just I just realized I couldn't do it. And I broke down completely, and I phoned home and I bawled my eyes out and I said I quit, and I'm not strong enough and I can't do it, and those naysayers were right, and it's done. And Mum said, okay, well, you're going through a new storm, you can't do anything about it right now, wait for the storm to pass, and on the back of it, if you want to go to Cape Town and come back, do it. Like, we'll support you 100%. But if you think that maybe there's a chance you want to continue, then do that. And so she then sent me an email that night. And in the email, she said, I just want you to imagine, like, put yourself in this situation. And in the email, she said, just imagine that you're 72 days into your world record. You never dismasted. You were still beating the men's record by 1 day, which I was at the time. And Australia was 4 weeks away. And then imagine that you're feeling like this, you're in conditions like this, you're seasick, you're miserable. Would that have been enough to make me quit? And for me, it was a real kind of logical reality check, because I'd gotten so emotional about the project and the trip, and I'd let that negativity from the people in the public get to me, and I'd sort of lost my confidence in my own abilities to succeed. And that allowed me to just go, oh, well, Cape Town's like just over there. It's 200 miles away. I'll pull the pin and I'll go back and everything will be fine and I'll be safe again. But it wasn't what I really wanted to do. And so I decided that I would actually push on and keep going. And in those conditions, I never would have quit, because I was looking at the restart of the record as part 2 of a record, whereas it was the continuation of part 1. And so with that, I was able to kind of, I guess, restructure it in my mind and kept going. And I ended up going through a storm so bad, it flipped the whole boat upside down. So I was on the roof. Knockdowns just became my new normal. When I finally crossed my position of dismasting, I had my first snowstorm and my first blizzard at sea. And so, it was pretty hardcore conditions. But now I know that the worst possible conditions I sailed in the Southern Ocean in winter, I'm going to do this next record and I'm going to be in the Southern Ocean in summer, and nothing's going to compare. And I was able to survive those conditions, and I was able to overcome those challenges, and I know the boat's capable. So it actually helps me now to get the confidence that I need to go and do the record again.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Lisa. I'd like to come back to your boat, and I'm a big fan of the Post-its. What are the Post-its about, and what do they mean?
So I have always been a very passionate kind of person with our environment. And when I did the Clipper race, I remember sailing up through Indonesia, and the pollution on the water was like soup. Like, there was just literally the kitchen sink floating past, and we had to have someone with a pole on the bow of the boat to push the bigger pieces of rubbish out of the way of the yacht as it sailed through. And it was just disgusting and terrifying and humbling to me. So I remember just thinking I wanted to be able to use my public platform as a way of creating a positive impact on our environment. And with that, I launched the Climate Action Now message. So I formally renamed the boat Climate Action Now, and I went out and I started collecting Post-it notes from people in the public. And each Post-it note was an environmental action of something that person was already doing towards a better future. And then we gathered hundreds of these Post-it notes up and we turned them into the digital wrap. And then we wrapped my entire 50-foot yacht in hundreds and hundreds of messages from community members, like people in the public. And then I sailed that boat 20,000 miles around Antarctica and around Australia, and proudly spread the fact that these are all actions that individuals are already undertaking. Just make a small change. We all have the power to create change, and it just starts with one action. So from that, for this record, I'm actually stepping it up, and I tried to get this going for the first record, and I couldn't get the funding together in time, but we're doing citizen science on board the boat. So I'm doing ocean health readings, dissolved carbon dioxide. I've partnered with several scientific organizations. So I'm working collaboratively with like Bureau of Meteorology to deploy drifter buoys, IMOS, which is the International Maritime Organization, to become a mobile weather station. I'm working with a bunch of different organizations, and we're doing all this research. And what we're doing is we're making it freely available to scientists globally so that they can then use that to facilitate their own research in climate science and ocean health data. And I'm also doing microplastic sampling, and I'm rolling out a 6-month school speaking program on arrival back in Australia as a free thing that I can offer to the public as my kind of contribution to our community, and a way of trying to spread the positive Climate Action Now message. So
yeah, I'm pretty sure we can entertain our audience also from 7 till 8.
Yes.
But let's have a little bit of look what we can find. So can I still write a post-it? Can we write a post-it for you and you put it on the boat?
Yep. So if you go to the website and you hit the tab Climate Action Now, and then in there's a tab that says Get Involved, and you write a message and you send it to me. We're actually just about to update the new wrap on the hull. So if you want to do it tonight or tomorrow, because the cutoff's pretty soon before the new wrap gets printed and goes on the boat for this next record. But if you get them in now, it'll actually make it on the hull of the boat and be sailed around in the next circumnavigation around Antarctica. So definitely get involved. Yeah.
Victoria and Kelly, I saw your questions, and I have one other one for Lisa, and unfortunately that will be the last one as I look at the time. Lisa, you have partnered for your current campaign, you have partnered with Clean Ocean Foundation to raise awareness of climate action now, and you are selling 360 degrees.
Yes.
It sounds curious, make me curious, what is it?
So, you know, with all of these things, and we haven't really had a chance to cover it yet, but I never get 100% funding, and I don't, unfortunately, have a naming rights partner for this project yet. So if you know anyone, please let me know. But instead of that, what I'm trying to do is work out a way to fund the project by inviting members of the public and business owners to buy a degree of the record. So it's $1,200. It's tax deductible through my partnership with the Clean Ocean Foundation. And then that money goes into the refit and the preparation of the boat, and also goes into funding the citizen science aspect of it. So the rental costs for the research units, like $50,000 alone. And then you've got lab processing fees, and you've got a whole bunch of expenses around that science aspect of things. So for me, it was a really great way for me to try and work out how can I make the project achievable for every business owner to get involved, for anybody who's thinks what I'm doing is just something cool and they want to support it, or they're really passionate about our environment and they want to help facilitate the citizen science aspect of things. You can buy a degree. I get your logos up on the website, and then when I'm sailing across your actual degree, so we allocate you a longitude of the record, then you'll get a shout out through my blog for that, and then you get access to the media packs and everything so that you can do your own promotions while I'm at sea and really interact around the project. So I had this lovely lady whose husband followed my last project. Every day he would read her at the blog, and unfortunately since then he's passed away, so she bought a degree in honor of his memory. And so, you know, his name's up on the website, and I've got other businesses, so it's a really nice way for people to really connect with the project. And unfortunately I'm still struggling to fund it, so I need as much help as I can get. So if anyone's out there that can do a degree, or you want to collaborate with a bunch of friends and get a community together to buy a degree together, you know, then please do, because I really could use all the help I could get at the moment.
That sounds really extraordinary. And Karen, I will just ramp it up. And Kelly and Victoria, please stay online. We answer your questions just after we ramp up, because I see that, of course, a couple of you may have dinner reserved at 7 p.m. I made that mistake already once this week. Lisa, I'm really happy for you that you found your dreams and that you set a goal and you just did it. I'm very sure that you are an absolutely inspiration for anybody to find dreams, but then also really just to do it.
Thank you.
I can just say we wish you all the best for your next trip at the end of this year. Everybody's actually quite looking forward to end of the year, as we hope that something will change for Australia as well. For you, it will be definitely a very big step going again around Antarctica solo. And as we will all now write post-its, note for the boat, and buy the remaining degrees, we will feel like being with you on the boat. So anyhow, we will all be with you in the Southern Ocean. I thank you so much for your time. I thank all the participants for listening to us. I'm sure we will have another time with you, Lisa. It's absolutely exciting listening to you, and your stories are so, you can't stop hearing them. Really
I always get in trouble for that.
It's really exciting.
It's
also,
great.
if anybody is interested, I have released a book called Facing Fear, which covers the whole Antarctica record. It's a great read, so I've been told. So you can pick up a copy on the website, or QBD bookshops have it as well. So you can grab a copy of that if you're interested in hearing more details about that first record.
Wonderful. Well, Lisa, I'm also looking forward to getting you back after after your successful circumnavigation of Antarctica. I know I certainly remember following you all the way around. I think I flew to South America at the time. I made the Qantas people look down and try and spot you in the ocean. But anyway, thank you everyone for joining us. If you do have a few questions, you can hang on the line, but otherwise I know there's a lot of people that are waiting for dinner. So
yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Victoria, you asked, how did you make decisions? Were they made quickly, or did you do risk assessment process in times of extreme risk given the fast-paced environment?
So generally, we tried to cover everything in the preparations as far as possible scenarios that I would encounter. And then I implemented a rule called Take 5. So it was just my own version of a rule. And the Take 5 rule is that in any high stress scenario, I take 5 seconds. So in that, I mean that if I have a sail that blows out and it snaps, I don't run up on deck outside and just suddenly start trying to like pull that sail down. I take 5 seconds and I assess the emergency and I assess the situation. I get my life jacket on, I get my safety tether on, I tether to the boat, and then I address the situation. So several times through the dismasting, I took 5 and I would step back and I would have to, again, take myself out of my shoes and put myself into just a logical thinking mode and kind of break down the stages that way. So that was generally what I did. More questions?
Thank you for that. Another question was, what was your lessons learned, and what are you going to do this time differently?
So quite a lot of the repairs that some of you will have seen on the boat are just due to the age of the boat. So she's a 2003 model, so she's 19 years old now. And I've sailed her 30,000 miles, and the previous owner had sailed her about 25,000 miles. So I'm doing a lot of the upgrades because of that and the nature of the fact that I'm heading to the Southern Ocean. One thing we did change is the chain plates on the boat. So where the side stays attached to the boat, they used to be inboard and on an angle, and that's where my spreader rigging wire would attach. What we've changed now is we've actually made them completely outboard on the hull of the boat, and that allows me to run a double spreader rig rather than a triple spreader rig. And by running a double spreader rig, it increases the wire holding power by about 30%. So if you imagine the first spreader on a double spreader rig is a couple of meters higher than one that's 3 spreaders. And because of that, it's holding all the weight above it. So a triple spreader mast is holding all the weight above the bottom spreader with those rigging wires. So it actually just adds that extra bit of security. I'm replacing my engine just because it's an old engine and she just needs a bit of TLC, and Volvo Penta have actually jumped on board to help me replace the engine, and we're running it with biofuels, so biodiesel, which is amazing and awesome. I use it mainly for an emergency redundancy as my just in case scenario, in case of another dismasting or collision or anything that might happen on this record. And one other thing that I'm changing is that my angle grinder would have been able to cut my rigging free in a few seconds flat if I was able to use it in the wet conditions I was in with a cutting blade. And I'd done all the right prep where it was inside a locker, it had the cutting blade fitted, it had a battery in it that was always fully charged, it had a spare battery that was always fully charged, ready for any dismasting scenario. But the situation was so wet because of these waves breaking over the boat that it was an impossibility to use an electrical item like that. So I've since found out that you can get these angle grinders that are submersible for clearance divers. They're about $2,500, so they're not cheap. But what a lot of people I don't think realize is that using bolt cutters on a pitching and rolling deck is just not necessarily always possible depending on the size of your rigging wire. My rigging wire was 14 mil. And when I tried it, I couldn't get the purchase. So quite often with bolt cutters, you have to jump on them. And I just couldn't get it to stay, and I was slipping and sliding all over the deck, and it was just not even making a dent in the wire. So yeah, definitely this project, I'm taking this battery operated submersible angle grinder. I'm also taking hydraulic wire cutters. If the angle grinder for whatever reason doesn't work, I've got a backup option that's going to work in the conditions that I was in last time in case of a dismasting.
Wow, it's absolutely amazing. I wish you definitely all the best for your trip. I'm very sure that we will hear from you before you go on your big trip. And we are looking forward to welcome you back in Albany in less than whatever days. We wish you all the best.
90 days, less than 90 days.
90 days. Awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for participating. And I hopefully see you soon in the club.
Yeah, and if you are interested, you can just go to the website, which is lisablairsalestheworld.com, and the degree tabs there if you want to become a degree sponsor, if you want to buy a book or check out any more information around the project. You can sign up for the newsletter and follow along. So make sure you check it out. Thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah, we will share all the links so everybody has a good chance to see it. Thank you very much.
Definitely. Okay.
Thanks everyone.